Welcome, everyone. It's good to see everyone. So exciting to see how many people are here to hear about the GAO report related to the Evidence Act, given that we've all been immersed in it now for several years. And so it'll be interesting to see how the conversation goes. And I want to thank the panelists for joining us. I look forward to the conversation. And I think I'll just get us started with some introduction first, and then I'll do some framing comments, and we can get into the conversation with the back and forth. Sitting two chairs from me, Melinda Buntin. Melinda joined the faculties of Health Policy and Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins as well in July 2023. As one of the top academic health policy leaders in the nation, Dr. Buntin is part of the university's Knowledge to Action and the Business of Health Bloomberg Distinguished Professor Cluster. Dr. Buntin joined Hopkins from Vanderbilt University, where she was the University Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Health Policy and of Medicine, Health, and Society, and held the Mike Kerb Chair for Health Policy in the Department of Health Policy, Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. Let's see, next to Melinda, Erika. Erika Rissi is Chief Evaluation Officer and Section Head of the Evaluation and Assessment Capability Section at the National Science Foundation. She previously led policy analyses to study and develop evidence-based recommendations for enhancing the NSF merit review process and was responsible for the development of the agency's learning agenda and annual evaluation plan. Ms. Rissi has had numerous NSF positions that brought together her experience in strategy design, strategy execution, and operations. She oversaw the strategy for modernizing NSF's legacy proposal and award management processes and systems, and was the business lead for research.gov. She designed and led a process for creating an agency reform plan, known as Renewing NSF, that incorporated ideas generated through agency-wide brainstorming sessions. Ms. Rissi developed surveys administered to 100,000 NSF customers to measure satisfaction, identify end-user critical IT needs, and evaluate changes to NSF's process for the merit review of proposals. Prior to joining NSF, she held positions at Grant Thornton, SRA International, and the Touchstone Consulting Group. At those employers, she advised C-level executives on grants management and policy, human capital, financial management, and agency management and operations. Ms. Rissi earned a BA in music from Yale University. Nick, sitting next to me. Nick Hart is the president and CEO of the Data Foundation. He's recognized as an advocate and leader for established systems and practices that enable evidence-informed policymaking and open data practices to succeed around the world to improve society. He's an expert in U.S. policies related to data evaluation, statistics, science, and privacy. During his professional career, Dr. Hart led initiatives in government and nonprofits, championing the use of data to improve society. He's a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration and the Bipartisan Policy Center. He previously worked at the White House Office of Management and Budget as the Policy and Research Director of the U.S. Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking and as the Director of the Evidence Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And then all the way on my right at the end of the table is Rachel Snyderman. Rachel serves as Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Her work is regularly featured in major media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Snyderman joined BPC following federal service with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Department of Commerce, and the Office of Management and Budget. She also spent time abroad with the US government, Innovations for Poverty Action, and the Mexican Ministry of Finance. Early in her career, Snyderman worked for Ernst & Young's quantitative economics and statistics practice in Washington. She earned her BA in economics and Latin American studies from Wellesley and holds an MA from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies where she is now an adjunct lecturer of international economics. So welcome to the members of the panel. And as I said, I'll start us out by providing some framing remarks about the report that we're going to be discussing. Now, this all comes from the Evidence Act. The introduction of the Evidence Act in 2018. Since then, agencies across the federal government have been working to enhance their capacity to build and use evidence to inform policy design, implementation, and coordination to differing degrees and levels of success. During our time together today, we'll dive into the findings from a recent US GAO report on evidence-based policymaking that's based on agency capacity assessments that were conducted by the agencies in 2022, according to the mandate of the Evidence Act. The GAO report, entitled Evidence-Based Policymaking Agencies Need Additional Guidance to Assess Their Capacity, reveals fresh data on the implementation of the Evidence Act and highlights how incomplete guidance and varied assessment methods have created challenges across federal agencies related to developing capacity assessments. The report describes common themes in agencies' capacity assessments, benefits and challenges related to conducting capacity assessments that were identified by the agency officials involved in the assessments, and it provides recommendations around improving agencies' capacity to build and use evidence. And that's critical because evidence helps decision makers at all levels of government and in every sector, as shown by the diverse backgrounds of our panelists. And it also helps us understand what works and what doesn't. Data research and evaluations shed light on the policies and programs that warrant further investment to make even greater impact and others that have room for improvement. Policymaking is grounded in evidence, policymaking that is grounded in evidence in this way is vital to improving health, social, and economic outcomes for people across the country. In fact, that's something my organization, Mathematica, strives for in the work that we do every day. Our mission is to improve public well-being by leveraging high-quality data and evidence. And as a former member of APPAM or as a current member of APPAM and a former president of APPAM, I'm fairly certain everyone gathered here today likely understands the importance of ensuring that decision makers have the best information available when confronting urgent health and social challenges. So let's dive in with the questions. And I'll start out with questions that relate to the general themes of the GAO report. And since this was a report really focused on capacity building, and as you can tell from the title of the report, part of the report is on the challenges related to capacity building, I'll start there. Erika, Rissi, you see this from the inside of an agency. So I'm sure you have lots to share with us in terms of insights. The report highlights those challenges as I described, particularly around capacity building. And I want to know from your standpoint, what do you see as the most significant hurdles that agencies face in developing their evidence capacity?
Thank you very much, Paul. So first off, a disclaimer, everything that I say today is my own personal opinion. It doesn't reflect the opinions of the National Science Foundation or the US government. So I think what I see is that a lot of the hurdles are really practical in nature. It's the Evidence Act put forward a lot of new requirements, and there were some new concepts, some new ideas that people had to sort of wrap their head around. Not everyone was familiar with what a learning agenda was, and even if they were sort of familiar conceptually. The leadership in the agencies had no idea what people were talking about. But really, I think it's been much more mundane. It's about, okay, how do I make space for this new activity and this new requirement? How do I convince the people that hold the money and the people resources that this is something that they should carve out of the existing pots to make room for? I think the good news is that these practical challenges are sort of bread and butter for, I think, federal administrators. There's nothing really specifically new or challenging about implementing the Evidence Act in the federal context compared to any other new activity. We're in sort of what I would say is a very normal startup mode for a new, potentially really transformative activity.
So the key phrase I'll take out of that is startup mode, because I think that's an important context for thinking about the findings of the report. Nick, a critical element of the discussion around the Evidence Act, and you've been involved in these discussions since the beginning of the discussions really around the Evidence Act, has to do with how do you balance flexibility and guidance. And so that can come up at different levels in the Act. So for example, I can imagine part of the discussion around the guidance reflects a desire to be as flexible as possible in terms of how the assessments are carried out. But at the same time, we heard people wanting more guidance. So that's one level in which it gets, which flexibility and guidance have to be balanced. Another level is when you're in an agency thinking about what kind of guidance do you give to programs versus the specifications for the agency as a whole. So I wondered about how you think of balancing those factors in this environment.
Sure. Well, hello, everybody. So my disclaimer is that I wish my opinion carried the weight of the U.S. government, but I work in a nonprofit, so I can't claim to be so bold. But I mean, this question really goes back to the heart of how the Evidence Act was designed. And I think the Data Foundation and American Evaluation Association just did a survey of federal evaluation officials. And one of the things, maybe not surprisingly, based on the discussion just now, is people ask for more guidance. But what does that really mean? When people ask for guidance, it can be a double-edged sword really quickly. And just from my opinion as a former OMB staffer, I would say, based on looking at what happened over the last 5 years relative to other government-wide initiatives that we've seen, things like GPRA, the Government Performance Results Act, implementation of Hart, the Program Assessment Rating Tool, and other adjacent topics, there were many cases where there was highly prescriptive guidance. And what manifested in the days and months and years that followed was not necessarily growth and capacity or what we aspire to, which is improvements in culture. So fast forward to where we are now with 5-year milestone of the Evidence Act. If you really look at the guidance that came out from the White House in its totality, and then the guidance that flowed down from agencies to bureaus and subunits, sure, there's flexibility, but I think there's enough at a macro level that gives a lot of context for how to do some of these things. Is it perfect? No. Is it ever going to be perfect for every single part of the federal government, which is a behemoth? No, probably not. When it comes to the capacity assessments in particular, which GAO spent an entire report talking about, it's hard for me to not think about the days when the Evidence Commission was making its recommendation that there should be capacity assessments in government. And here's the secret. Nobody knew how to do it. The entire concept was based on Joe Holy's evaluability assessments and the recognition that we needed to have some basic understanding of where we were starting so that we could build from there. So should every agency be able to do its own assessment? Yes. Should every agency have a good look and feel that maybe we can compare across each other? I think we can hope for that, but we've been trying to do this kind of comparability in everything from budget spending to FTE counts for decades. And, federal folks in the room, give yourselves a pat on the back because it was hard, and the next iteration is also going to be hard. But this is the context in which we're talking about rigidity versus flexibility.
And we're in starter mode, like Erika said. So, so one word there I want to return to later, so remind me, is culture, because I think that's an important part of some of the discussion we'll have later. Melinda, the question for you is kind of cutting to the chase. So we are where we are in terms of our current capabilities. So if you think of that as the current state, what's the likely impact of the current state on the future of policy implementation?
Well, thanks for that question, Paul, and for the introduction, which probably sounded to many people in the audience like a whole string of sort of academic gobbledygook titles. Probably the more important thing to note is that I think I'm maybe the one person on the panel who's actually sat in an agency and tried to respond to OMB requests about what the heck I was doing. So prior to being at Vanderbilt, I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services as well as the Congressional Budget Office. And when I was at HHS, we did have to send a lot of information up to OMB, and I actually sat on the HHS Data Council, which was a wonderful group of people, just people like us, people you wanted to have a really long meeting in a really dingy government conference room with. And I loved every minute of it. But then I went and I was starting a department at Vanderbilt School of Medicine focused on health policy and economics for a decade. And until I found out about this panel, I didn't know about what the Evidence Act was. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to tell all of you what I had to learn to be ready to answer these questions from Paul. So it looks like what happened is that in about 2016, Paul Ryan and Patty Murray, people in two different houses of Congress on two different sides of the aisle, decided that evidence-based policymaking was pretty important. You can imagine, it was a pretty important year, wasn't it? And they together passed a piece of legislation that established a commission on evidence-based policymaking. And that commission came up with 24 recommendations, of which 10 were included in the Evidence Act that passed the following year in 2017. Nick, you probably know what the 14 were that weren't included. I don't remember them, but you probably know. And so 10 of them were in this act that was passed, and there were questions about whether the Trump administration would sign it, or Trump would sign it. The Bipartisan Policy Center put out a 10-page sort of FAQ about the evidence, about this act. But then, off it was. And what did it require? It required a whole bunch of things about releasing data to the public and protecting privacy. And it also did the things that this specific GAO report focused on, which was in every agency, make sure that there was a data council, there was an evidence officer, and there was someone who could coordinate an interagency council, which reported up, I think, to OMB, as well as having their own agency council. So this sounds like a lot of structure. And my former agency CBO estimated that it would cost $75 million a year to implement, about $1 million per agency. And I do wonder if the Evidence Act requires that we find out whether that $1 million per agency was well spent. There's probably some evidence about that, but maybe that's something for all of you. Maybe that's a dissertation. So where does that leave us now? I mean, I think it's a very interesting moment. So here we are at the beginning of another Trump administration. We're asking ourselves questions about what we do. Like, we generate evidence for policymakers. What is the role of that? We have people who are being appointed to positions who are taking different stands on the evidence than prior administrations have, and then maybe people in the room do. So we're at a critical juncture. And what we've learned from this report is that every agency has set up these structures. So maybe every agency is in a better position now to actually synthesize, use, and defend the evidence that their agencies have put together. But maybe we're just still in startup phase, as you said.
Rachel, how can we ensure that the evidence that we generate or the agencies generate is relevant to current policy needs? Are there certain criteria or principles that we should be following?
Thank you for the question, and thank you all. It's a pleasure to join you today, and I see many former OMB colleagues in the room, so it's just quite a sweet treat to be up here. I think that, echoing many of my co-panelists' comments, one of the remarks that I wanted to put is that, we're building an extraordinarily difficult and new muscle for the largest organization in the country. And I think that can, I think as we're talking about startup mode and a lot of, I think that is extraordinarily difficult and an extraordinary success that has taken place as a result of this act and this work. When it comes to ensuring that, we're using evidence to meet current policy needs, I think it's, I kind of look at this from both the agency side and the agency capacity, obviously, and of course, the role of OMB. So I think first on the agency side, this is where it is really important that evidence teams within federal agencies are centralized and that they are done so in the front office. We have in federal agencies, there's obviously the office of the secretary or the head of the agency, but this is really where evidence teams need to be plugged into the policy and the strategy operations that exist within that apparatus of an agency so that they are well linked to what the policy goals are and so that the evidence can then help inform direction or changes in those policy goals as administrations obviously change, and of course as federal programs continue to operate. I think that on the side of OMB, this is really where the power of the agency in terms of how resource management offices, so kind of the budget apparatus of the agency, works really closely in tandem with the evidence team and with colleagues on the management side of the organization. Each year the resource management offices, who are kind of staffed to assist every single federal agency with the preparation of the president's budget, ask a lot of federal agencies through the pass-back process that helps to go inform the budget in the fall. And this is really where I think, when I was at OMB, we worked hand in glove with our evidence team colleagues to ensure that we were in lockstep and helping build that capacity and build that muscle. And so while these capacity assessments are done every 5 years, I think that there's an opportunity to ensure that this is a more routine, partnership internally. And I know, that is obviously, that is done, but I haven't been at the agency for some years now. But I think that this is really where there is an opportunity for that improved coordination or potential improved coordination, and recognizing too that each agency has its own baseline and perhaps in different evidence goals. And so I think that if you have that coordination to meet those policy needs, both at the federal, on the agency level, with that coordination in a front office capacity, and then of course across OMB internally, that can set well up.
Rachel, you set up implicitly a choice between being centralized and decentralized. And I want to make sure I understand the point you're making. Are you making the point that this should be a evidence leadership team that's centralized, or are you making the point that the evidence generation capabilities of an agency should be centralized?
The evidence generation within that be centralized, within on the federal agency side, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think. And that's just, again, I am speaking kind of from where I am now, but
right.
in terms of seeing how, especially new leadership comes into these positions and has different policy agendas and policy needs, I think there's an opportunity there for coordination.
Yeah. One thing that I think about in that choice is, how do you make sure there is at least enough evidence generation capacity throughout the agency so that when people are making critical decisions, whether it's about individual programs or specific offices, they're close enough that they're willing to rely on the evidence from somebody that they're familiar with, that they work with frequently. Sometimes I worry that, if it's too centralized, there's this tendency to avoid it or minimize it because it slows the process down.
We all need to remember, the Evidence Act didn't create evidence for the first time, evidence building for the first time in the federal government. Evidence building has always existed. I think what the Evidence Act has helped to do is maybe provide some more structure around it, provide language that we can agree to use around evidence building. So at NSF, we do have a centralized component, and that's the part that I sit in. Mm-hmm. But there is very, very robust evidence building activity happening all across the agency. And so a large part of what my office does is, yes, we build some guidance and support them in their efforts. We also engage very deeply with the chief data officer to make sure that they understand how to prioritize their investments that to help advance our goals around evidence, and do it in such a way that benefits not just the work that we're doing in my office, but benefits the entire agency and the public. So, so I think this whole centralized versus decentralized is a little too simplistic a way to think about it. We need all of it.
Yep.
And I guess I mean to say that I really want to emphasize that it should be a front office priority. And I think that that is, ensuring that agency leadership are equipped with the data and the evidence to make informed policy decisions and support the needs of agency staff and the programs that they are there representing to ensure that they are delivering for the American people. I mean, I think that is the crux of the issue.
Good. Erika, we talked about the challenges here that are mentioned in the GAO report. So one of the issues is there a way to refine the guidance for OMB to refine the guidance so as to be helpful to ensure agencies can interpret it and implement it?
So, I mean, sure. But I guess I wouldn't necessarily recommend that that's where we spend our energy. I think the reality is that, so I have teenagers, and, whenever they learn a new subject in school, the teacher starts with the textbook, and they read the material in the textbook, and they definitely have not learned anything once they've finished reading that textbook. And then they have to dive into like trying to apply that thing that they've theoretically learned in the textbook. And they realize that, oh, well, the textbook, it's a nice theoretical way of looking at that thing, but the world is much more complex. And so it's the process of taking that theory that's in that textbook and trying to apply it in the real world, not once, which let's keep in mind with the capacity assessment, we've done it exactly once now, but applying it again and again in new contexts and new places at different scales with, kind of different people. And that's where the learning happens. And so I worry that if we spend too much time trying to clarify the guidance and make the guidance perfect, what we actually just do is force people to spend more time reading the textbook, which isn't where the learning is going to happen.
Yeah, so focus on experience. And as you said, we're still in startup mode. Yep.
Yeah, if I might just add to that, because I agree with what you said, and I love how you said it. It's hard for me to imagine that it would be the best use of people who worked at OMB's time to refine this guidance further, as opposed to providing the technical assistance that might be needed to implement the existing guidance in each of those dozens and dozens of federal agencies. I think that would be the way I'd spend my time.
Okay, I have to jump in too.
And now we're off script.
Okay, so I'm also putting on my old OMB hat. There's this document at OMB called OMB Circular A11. Can I get a show of hands if you've ever heard of that before? Okay, so you all work in government. Well, here's the secret. Most people at OMB haven't read it. It's long. There's tons of stuff. We know how to control F documents. The purpose of a guidance document.
If you're on the budget side, you've read it.
It's 1,000 pages. And, we have to be honest, the guidance documents are to put people in a common direction. That really long A11 is a great example of that. And I think OMB should get a lot of credit for the guidance that currently exists on the capacity assessments. And yes, we could, your answer of sure is perfect, because yes, we could keep revising it ad nauseum, but to what end? Let's focus on implementation.
Okay, good. So let's carry the same framing over to how to conduct assessments of capacity. So Melinda, what role should additional guidance play in standardizing assessments? Nick, you weighed in a little bit on that. And you said, gee, it's nice if we can compare them, but it's not, it may not be the ultimate goal. So Melinda, I'd be interested in your views on how far should we go in driving consistency across the agencies through guidance.
Yeah, I read that and I thought, well, okay, I've only worked at one agency, that's HHS, and it is an extraordinarily large agency. It spends $1.7 trillion, has over 85,000 employees, and it's hard for me to imagine standardized guidance even working for that one agency. So again, for me, I think it's more about having, as Rachel said, a priority at the secretary level, and then figuring out how within that agency you're actually going to implement the existing guidance and tailor it to each different program that you are trying to assess or evaluate. And then again, lots of people in the room are probably methodologists as well. I mean, the idea that OMB could issue guidance about what methods to use to evaluate programs that are extraordinarily disparate, I don't think that would be worthwhile. I think thinking about a ranking of different types of evidence that could help people think about how to classify the evidence that they produce, maybe something like that would be useful. But not prescribing how you would generate evidence, what methods to apply to any given situation.
Rachel, did you want to weigh in at all on guidance?
I did, because I know that we had some questions as a panel about, the role of OMB and potentially, including additional guidance on accountability to agencies. And I think that this is where I think that the accountability is on Congress, right? To take what is put forth as evidence-based policy recommendations from agencies and change laws, right? And so I think that that's where we know when it comes on accountability, like I agree with the sentiments here on, that's not OMB's job to write into guidance, agency accountability. I think OMB does that through I think that's frankly part of OMB's mission, is to help with many different accountability features across the federal government. But I think when it comes to ensuring that we are using evidence to make informed decisions, we need to ensure that policymakers are then taking that data, being armed with it, and then doing something with it, as opposed to looking the other way and not course correcting when the data clearly says to do so, or otherwise.
So Erika, what lessons do you think we've learned from this process so far? And how do we go about sharing those lessons and how we approach evidence building? What are the practical steps that we can take to facilitate that sharing? And do you have a candidate for a lesson learned?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think I'm going to lean back on that idea of culture, and that, it's through that development of culture that, a lot of those lessons learned need to be promulgated. And it's really all about people also. I think there's a lot of emphasis oftentimes in, maybe GAO reports specifically, or in guidance document, all around creating systems and kind of this idea that if you can create a system around something, you bake it in and it sort of lives beyond itself. And I think that is can be helpful, but I think if you don't have the people and if you don't have the culture around those systems, you're still not going to get very far. So, I do think that so far the best ways that I've seen, good things spread is through the people that are working on these issues. I think we all know how unlikely it is a piece of paper that gets published somewhere is, how unlikely it is that that's going to change much of anything without people taking that up, taking those ideas and then championing them and carrying them forward. And so I think that's something that we need to really focus on, is continuing to identify how we can work with and through people to get these ideas moving and continuing to spread forward. And I think maybe people focus on systems because people are hard, right? And they think that if you can create a system, you don't have to solve the people problem, and I just don't think that's true.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on a lesson learned from this process so far? Okay.
Who in this room, raise your hand if you consider yourself purely objective all the time? All right, raise your hand if you have values. Now raise your hand if you think everybody in this room is going to agree on the definition of evidence. Policymakers are no different. Everybody's approaching the problems from a different lens. We're making really complicated decisions for the American people and businesses every single day, every single minute. Some of them are elected, some of them are appointed, and some of them are program managers that are senior executives. This is a wickedly complex set of things. And that's just like an hour of normal life and how our country operates. Imposing this broader philosophy about evidence-informed policymaking it's not new, but it has gained a lot of steam. So what is the lesson learned? One, and I'm going to give maybe a couple here. We know that evaluation as a field is a transdiscipline. Yes, there are particular places where you can get a degree, but we think about it as a combination of a lot of different things and cross-cutting in government and how we actually implement in a real-time basis. That's kind of like a monumental concept for some agencies and activities because that's not how we structure things in government. We typically will say like, this is your topic, this is your thing. In academia, we say this is your school, this is your discipline, this is your degree, go forward and prosper. But in evaluation, we actually need all these things to come forward and work together. The Evidence Act was designed intentionally to have multiple things working together, and that was actually sort of revolutionary as a concept in government. The data governance people, the evaluation teams, the statistical agencies. So increasingly, we're using this terminology around an ecosystem for evidence. So why is this a revolutionary insight and lesson? Because it's not how we talk about it. It's not how we operate, it's not how we're designed. And I think increasingly we see some of the audits and performance reviews that are coming out of GAO recognize this, even though they may not use the same terminology. But to your term, the use of culture, or the use of the term culture, I think this is a moment where we've seen that manifestation in government. So this is a pretty phenomenal change. And if I tie it back to the GAO report on capacity assessments, what does that mean? It means that we have not adequately analyzed the capacity and capability of government to do this work because we skipped a whole bunch of people. Some agencies did not include their statistical agencies. We spend $7 billion a year in discretionary funding on federal statistical agencies, and that doesn't even include the 130 units that aren't formal statistical agencies. They should probably be part of that assessment. We have no idea how much we really spend on data governance activities. And when we really get into the weeds on evaluation, we struggle to calculate what that number is. So do the capacity assessments tell us something useful? Absolutely. Do they capture everything? Absolutely not. But think about the big picture. It's getting bigger.
So let's switch from just the focus on capacity to what we're trying to ultimately drive, which is success. Is there a policy success story that we can point to that's a result of the evidence building that the Act helped to facilitate, or is it too soon?
I mean, I'm not going to have anything, that means anything to you all, but it's little successes. Like we did include our statistical agency in our capacity assessment. It was actually, which is the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. So to me, that relationship that we have been building with the statistical agency that's housed within NSF, the relationship that we've built with our chief data officer, and how we are working together on a whole host of things to help advance the agency forward in our ability to bring evidence to bear on kind of issues of importance. That is a huge success and a huge win. It's not really visible outside of NSF, but I think that is something that I would point to as a success.
I don't know.
So many of you in the room work in government, and this will be my appeal to you to better tell these stories, because even that comment of "I don't know" is actually really striking and accurate from what we see across the work in implementing the Evidence Act, is that we're so focused on the day-to-day, which don't stop doing that, by the way, but we also have to be clear about explaining what the value proposition is. So it's not just about building the evidence, but also about using it. Some of the clearest articulations of value that I've seen in the last couple of years have come out of the work of what's Title II of the Evidence Act, the Open Government Data Act. And a lot of these success stories are, not things that you're going to see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, but they're really powerful because they connected a user to the data that they were seeking to solve a problem. So let me give you an example. The State Department is currently one of the largest chief data offices in the entirety of the federal government. For anyone who's tracked the work of the State Department over decades, that's one of the agencies that we would have expected to probably be at the bottom of the list for advancing really quickly and developing its capacity to develop a chief data office and therefore evaluation capacity. And it's not to say that there aren't good people working at the agency. There are phenomenal people working at the State Department. But foreign affairs is known for having a lot of ideological perspectives implemented in how you make decisions. However, they prioritized creating a CDO to support decision-making across the entirety of the agency. The law requires there be a CDO at the departmental level. State Department created bureau-level CDOs. They've implemented this value proposition across the entire chain of decision-making in the department. So some of the things that they do to make it successful. You may have heard something about China recently in the last, couple of years in the United States and competition that we're facing, diplomatic relations, et cetera. And the State Department, when the Office of the Chief Data Officer says, across the entirety of the department, today we're gonna work on how we're resolving issues related to China. What does that do? It focuses the attention and the activity, and everybody brings their data about China to the table. It's a focusing event. And they've done this now in a lot of really targeted ways with great success. Why does that matter for the leadership and the decision-making capability? It gives them something to actually use that didn't exist before, or if it did exist before, nobody knew about it. So wherever you are, and whether it's the research community or in government itself, I think this would be my suggestion as we go forward, is to think about where those high value salient examples are. It's not to say you stop doing the other things that are critical for the evidence building work, but ensuring that the leadership has something that recognizes that this can be used and it's not going to just sit on a shelf.
So let's switch to looking forward a little bit. Some issues have already come up in terms of recommendations, but I wanted folks to have a chance to weigh in on other recommendations that they may have for how we move forward effectively to strengthen the process. And also, what should we all be doing to help in our various roles through this system?
We've talked a lot about building agency capacity here. And I think it's also just important to point out that there's actually a lot of capacity building that needs to happen out in the research community as well. Not necessarily maybe in technical skills. I think the research community has technical skills, aplenty, and there's always an appetite for growing more. And I think that's obviously a very key strength. But the way that I tend to see the research community is as a partner in evidence building. My agency is small, small for the government. And the evidence building team is, small. And so we don't, to be honest, we rely really heavily on the research community, whether it's academic researchers or contractors that we engage, to really do a lot of that evidence building work on our behalf, and we sponsor it. We have very strong opinions on how that work should be done, and we're very muscular about that. But it's I think one of the things that I commented on earlier today in a conversation is that, I looking around at sort of the APPAM agenda, there's not a lot that's being talked about these last few days that is really directly related to NSF's core mission around basic research and the importance of basic research as a foundational investment that we need to be making as a nation for the health of our country. There's a lot on phenomenally important topics, right? So, not to minimize any of the really interesting and important research that's being done, but there's not a lot that is being talked about there that's relevant to most of what my agency cares about. And I suspect I'm not the only, federal person that looks around and says, there's some really important research questions that are relevant to what my agency is trying to do that I don't see a lot of interest in the research community. So I think that's the kind of capacity building within the research community that I would just love to see. Taking a look at, what are the big policy questions at all levels? And do we have the people doing the research in those areas that can be brought to bear to answer some of those questions?
I'll just add to Erika's point. I mean, what better time than to make that, to have that call as a public servant to fill that mission? Because look at the news. The question of government's efficiency is front and center, right? And I think that is, we have the tools, we have the solutions, we have the people. We just have to demonstrate it and make it louder. And that's where, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, for example, we work hand in glove to uplift, the work and the evidence base that exists and is only, expanding across the federal government. And I think that, this is also a question to be thinking about in the time of post-Chevron deference, where policy goals of federal agencies could change and will change. And we already have the evidence base that's being built and that is strong and that capacity at federal agencies to help understand what this new reality will look like, how we will adapt, and how we will have to change policy to reflect that change. So I do think that there are a lot of questions as I'm kind of thinking about what the next few years will bring, but it's really, I think, a way in which I think there's a tremendous kind of call to action, right, to just only bolster the work that's already being done.
Well, that was actually a really nice way to wrap up that question, so I hate to step on it. I mean, it's a call to action. There's going to be a lot of change. Regulations are going to change. Priorities are going to change. And whether the evaluations of the effects are done within government or by people outside of government, it's really important to at least learn from the changes.
Okay, I wish I had something like super profound to say here, but maybe refer back to this survey we did with the American Evaluation Association about federal evaluators and some of the things that they told us. Needless to say, you need resources to do all this work. There are multiple purposes for conducting evaluations, and for decades we focused primarily on accountability. Increasingly, we focus on continuous improvement and learning. That is a culture change, by the way, in many agencies. But some of the agencies are trying to do this with like 0.1 FTE, 10% of a person. That's not very much by really anybody's measure. So at a practical level, we do actually need people in the community of practice to engage and support the work. But I don't think we can just walk around and say, we need more money to save you money. That's not necessarily a very compelling argument, though there are parts of government that do proffer that as a solution. I think it comes back to demonstrating the value proposition in real time. And this has been a core message out of OMB. It's been a core message out of GAO, actually, since they've started doing these analyses and reports, that we need to be making progress. So I actually will disagree that the Evidence Act is in startup mode, that it's 5 years in, almost 6 years now. But in some parts of government, there's an incredible level of maturity around some of these concepts. And the challenge for us is to recognize that even in those places that are more mature, they're still struggling in many cases. So while the Evidence Act can help propel some of the activities, if we don't have the people who are the knowledge brokers and the intermediaries who can help translate the research to the policymaker at the right time in the right way, and somehow a magical bullet that answers all their problems, we're not going to be able to address their policy needs and wants at any given time. So there's a missing piece in the pipeline that I think, whether it's OMB or GAO or on the Hill, the CBOs and the Congressional Research Services, we need to do more in our institutions to think about that. And I will double down on the comment that the research community has a tremendous role to play here, because government can't do this alone. Even though there's some agencies that do think they can do it alone, we should also help them with their public engagement processes. The current administration, the Office of Management and Budget, have an activity out right now for feedback. Speaking of engagement, where it's a very intentional effort to look at government engagement processes, and it has a direct intersection to exactly what we're talking about here. This shouldn't be happening in a vacuum. You shouldn't get the final evaluation report or the study with high impact, potential savings, whatever it is, and then everyone's shocked. And yet in academia, we sometimes set up these perverse incentive structures to hide your research until the point of publication so that you can make a splashy press release. And that's not necessarily a critique of any individual. This is a misalignment of how the policy system works and how other systems are set up. So how do we solve that? That's your job, Paul.
I was going to say, I thought that was technologies, Joe.
AI.
Don't get me started. Any final points that people wanted to make that they haven't been able to make already before we open it up for the room? Erika, I'll take up your AI remark. And the reason I bring it up is because of Nick's use of the word culture. I don't know how well this applies to the federal government because there are all kinds of constraints that you face with respect to management in federal agencies. But I was at an AI conference last week, and there was a gentleman there from an executive from Microsoft, and he was talking about the culture they were creating around the use of AI. So, their modern version of evidence building. And the metaphor that he used was there's the cultivated garden and there's the wild garden. And he wanted to make sure that he was prodding people to operate in the wild garden rather than the cultivated garden. The cultivated garden would be slow. People would wait for permission. They might think they have to learn how to code if they didn't already know how to code. He wanted them out in the wild garden where they were empowered to make decisions based on leveraging AI. And they set the context for that by in two ways. One, they gave people enough training, which is really framing about how to think about using AI in their day-to-day management responsibilities. But then also, as part of that framing, they let people know that they weren't expected to become coders. They were supposed to learn how to use no-code options using AI, and that they could do that speaking English. I thought that was a really important framing for them, and I think that Microsoft swears by that kind of prodding people to be out there and just making discoveries on their own in a way that's completely culture focused. So I wondered, if there's anything in there for lessons in terms of how we generate evidence in the federal government and really drive evidence-focused or evidence-informed management. Because ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get policymakers and administrators to make decisions that are based on evidence. And for them, it's a matter of doing their management job well. And we don't want to turn them into researchers necessarily. We want to give them the tools to make decisions as if they had been researchers.
Who wants to start?
Go ahead.
Well, I think that all sounds good, right? But I think I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think that Microsoft, since you mentioned them, they have a perspective, right? And that perspective is informed by where they sit and what they're trying to achieve. I like to say that as every single federal employee, no matter what we're doing day in, day out, our job is to make the lives better of every single American, right? That is an awesome mission. And we do it in our little ways, in our little corners, and that comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. And so that kind of sort of loosey-goosey, let's see what happens, you don't have to be an expert to do good things, is true. And the cost of making a mistake for Microsoft is quite a bit different than the cost of making a mistake if you work in the federal government. And not every obviously not every single decision that people in the federal government are making have those kinds of implications. So there is a place for that kind of unrestrained exploration. I do think, though, that that this idea that you shouldn't have to be an expert to use evidence is absolutely true, right? And I think that is, I think, incumbent on all of us to really understand how we can make the work that we do accessible to everyone who needs to understand what we're trying to communicate. And that, you know, that has nothing to do with AI. But, and I like wild gardens. I like, you know, cultivated gardens, but I don't like snakes. So.
I guess the key of evidence generation is that you're creating something new and you're answering a question. And the current technologies that we have, that we think of as AI, like large language models, do not create new knowledge. They just predict the next word based on all the words that have been said that were fed into it. And they don't know how to ask good questions. And that's why we need all of us in this room to ask the right questions. Maybe at some point, another type of AI tool, like machine learning, could help us understand the answer or get to an answer. But even there, I think asking a question, posing it as a hypothesis, and then testing that hypothesis is not what AI is currently set up to do. So I think its applicability is limited now in the types of topics we're talking about, but I do hope it improves.
Okay, so I have to jump in. Who here used AI today? Yeah, just raise your hand. You did it, whether you know it or not. Okay. We've been using AI in our society for years, and I mean, every time you do a Google search, there's AI behind it. So if you use Google or Bing or whatever platform you have, there's probably AI somewhere in your search. We have a remarkable lack of understanding and awareness of what AI is in our country. Now, stack on policymaking. There are, in fact, some policymakers that still think we're only talking about killer robots. And you can laugh at that, that's okay, but it's also a problem in how we think about this in the moment that we're in. AI is potentially hugely revolutionary for every single person in this room, whether you're doing research or whether you're working in government, and not everybody sees it that way. So let me give you one example. If we are collecting, I can't remember how many hundreds of billions of dollars we estimate the value of government data at from the Paperwork Reduction Act, but let's just go with it's a lot. There's a lot of duplication in that. Well, what happens when we start applying things that are approved information collection requests using the capabilities of artificial intelligence? Maybe we can start to identify where there's duplication. Maybe we can then allocate or reallocate the resources that are spent on crappy data towards better data or improving the data. Maybe we can reduce the burden on the American people. And maybe, in translation, we can make some better evaluations that are more useful to policymakers. That is one very easy opportunity that you could do today. I'm not giving out any CBI, I'm not giving out any secrets. You can take information collection requests and put them in Claude from Anthropic. You could use ChatGPT. You could start doing the analysis today. Government could do that. We're not, by the way. There are also places where we've built massive treasure troves of knowledge to support you, the evidence building community, and all of the research that you're producing to support decision makers. One of them, and my favorite to use in this example, is at the Department of Education, ERIC. Who knows ERIC or has a friend named ERIC? Yeah, okay, you can raise your hand. So ERIC has tens of thousands of studies in it. Many of them are hard-coded PDFs, not PDF-As that are machine readable, they're regular PDFs, which means they're not really useful in what we call the semantic web, which means AI is stuck. And that's a travesty. That means that we can't unlock that information. And here's one of what this all sort of builds to. Government has a cultural problem around the word failure. So the two examples that I just gave you are things that we could do today. But we have all of these other systems that are in place in government that are actually the backbone is data, and we can't let government systems fail. When a Social Security Disability Insurance beneficiary needs their benefits at the end of the month so that they can survive, you can't let that system fail. And there are so many people that want to come in and say, look, let's just fix the system. AI can actually help us in really targeted ways make improvements to begin chipping away at some of these things that are just long-held pain points but we're not able to deploy, and it is because we're so afraid of the failure risk. That's not a critique. That's the reality that if you're out there in the American public, you have to be conscious of. Government operates in a different context than we do in the private sector. I can launch an AI platform in my nonprofit with my team tomorrow, and if it fails, nobody's gonna die, hopefully. We won't do cars. But to me, the question is like a little bit back to Paul and those who are contracting in the evaluation community and all of you who are researchers, how do we overcome this and help those who are in government at OMB, at GAO, our great leaders in evaluation, recognize that in some places it is okay to fail. We actually need you to fail because that's a sign that you're doing enough of this work that we can learn from it.
Well, we need to wrap up. I appreciate so many of you showing up for this session, and I'd like you to help me thank our panelists today who did such a great job.